Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to the Meiji Guillotine Murders by Fūtarō Yamada, translated by Bryan Karetnyk. A strange incident at the Tsukiji Hotel, Chapter 6. Oh, they've forgotten something! The porter cried out shortly after Nagasaka and his party had disappeared from the tower. On the window ledge lay a smoking pipe. It must belong to Nagasaka, said Kawaji, picking it up. He's always forgetting things. Here, you'd better take this and run after him. After the porter had gone tearing down the staircase, Kazuki turned to Kawaji. Nagasaka is certainly devoted to his family, don't you think? That's rare for an official these days. He's very fortunate. It's just a pity they let him work in the Imperial Prosecuting Office. By the way, said Kazuki, that Saruki. I doubt he was there simply as their guide. Sugi's caught him by the tail, it would seem. I suppose it's only to be expected, given he's got Nagasaka by the tail as well. It was only a hunch the other day, but now I'm more and more convinced of it. Did you notice something? Well, you saw Nagasaka's daughter. Sugi seems to be awfully interested in her, although she was giving him a wide berth. Nagasaka can't be unaware of this, and yet, still, he won't tell his subordinate to back off. I'm beginning to think Sugi must have something on him, or am I being overly suspicious? I suppose it takes a lady killer like yourself to pick up on such subtleties between men and women. This strange compliment made Kazuki laugh. Well, you're not wrong that Sugi has won over Nagasaka, said Kawaji, nodding. I know somebody else who used to be in the Kyoto branch of the Imperial Prosecuting Office around the time of the Yokoi case, and I found out a thing or two from him. Oh? Apparently, Nagasaka bungled the investigation. Twice over. Bungled it? How? It's a long story, but hear me out. On the 5th day of the first month, Yokoi Sensei was attacked by 6 men, but one of them, Tokuzo Yanagida, was struck down by Yokoi Sensei's attendant, Shikanosuke Shimozu, and, though severely wounded, he was taken into custody. Yanagida died before he could be interrogated, although his name was enough to establish who his accomplices were. Of the accomplices, Shiro-zaemon Tsugi, who had been hiding out in Kyoto, was caught on the 14th, and 2 days later, despite having made it all the way to Mount Koya. So were Rupu Ueda and Matanojo Kashima. Yet, in the confusion, the remaining 2, Rikio Maeoka, and Toneo Nakai, had managed to slip past the cordon that was set up at the city limits, and their whereabouts are still unknown. Nagasaka's first mistake was to do with Nakai's escape. As head of the Imperial Prosecuting Office in Kyoto, he was in charge of the checkpoint at Awataguchi, and reports came in saying that Nakai was heading in that direction. They didn't know what he looked like, but they were told that he was a ferocious and cunning man with a large beard, and that he would be carrying a 3-foot sword in a red lacquered sheath. So all the men who approached Awataguchi carrying long swords were stopped and questioned, but it was later discovered that Nakai had sailed straight through, having shaved his beard and carrying only a short sword in his belt. It was an appalling blunder to make. It wasn't the only checkpoint he slipped past, so Nagasaka alone wasn't to blame. But then he went on to make a second mistake. On the 14th, as I've just said, one of the assassins, Shiro-Zaimon-suke, was arrested. Since the name Shiro-Zaimon is so pompous and old-fashioned, more often than not, he was called by his childhood name Shikata. And so, at first, that was the name under which the authorities tried to find him. But then there was Shikanosuke Shimozu, Yokoi Sensei's attendant from Higo, which is to say Yoshinosuke's elder brother. Such a formidable man. He managed not only to kill Yanagida, but also to pursue Tsuge part of the way after he'd run off with Yokoi Sensei's head. In the end, though, he'd failed to protect Yokoi Sensei, and he was detained by the Imperial Prosecuting Office. This is where it gets interesting. Yokoi's attacker was Shikata, and his bodyguard was Shikanosuke. What are the chances of the men on either side having such similar names? You couldn't make it up. Anyway, the execution of the culprits who are still in custody was delayed by objections from Kaieda's office, but immediately after the incident, the Kyoto authorities had, of course, been in a state of such excitement that orders were given to behead them all immediately, including Shikata Tsuge. In fact, it was none other than Nagasaka who signed the execution orders. Only he'd inadvertently written down the culprit's name as Shikanosuke. What? It was only at this point that, for the first time, Kazuki could not contain his astonishment. Actually, I don't know the ins and outs of it. The man who told me wouldn't go into details. The other half is my imagination. I'm sure I'm right though. Shikata and Shikanosuke. Of course, nobody would mix them up saying the names aloud, but it's easily done when you write them down. Only that careless Nagasaka could have done it. But still, Shikanosuke was also from Higo, so that name must have been familiar to him. Maybe he wrote the name down in a moment of madness. It was Sugi who received the order and executed Shikanosuke Shimozu accordingly. He apparently thought that Shikanosuke was being put to death for having failed to protect Yokoi Sensei. After all, when Naosuke Ii was killed, his bodyguards were all held responsible for his death and duly executed. So there was a precedent. Still, this was different. There are reasons to believe that Tsugi was aware of Nagasaka's mistake and, without questioning it, deliberately killed the wrong man. What's more, that business about the sword testing seems to be true. It was revenge for some disagreement they'd had back in Kumamoto. Kazuki was silent. Kawaji continued. I doubt that Nagasaka would have deliberately written the wrong name with some ulterior motive. It was a careless mistake, but not one without a consequence. When he found out about it later, he was horrified, and that's when Sugi tore into him. As he said, people began to talk, And back in Kumamoto, there were rumors that, because of a grudge, he'd use Shikanosuke to try out a new sword. Sugi took the brunt of the notoriety, and that's why Nagasaka is in his debt. If all this is true, it's astonishing that they've been able to keep it under wraps. But then it's so absurd that it would have been difficult to make public without calling the new government's competence into question. The man who told me also warned me not to make it public. On the other hand, Nagasaka's winning character must have played a part in this as well. After all, he's a favorite of Lord Kujo's. As for Sugi, he doesn't want to have anything to do with his native Higo, which has become a backwater since the restoration. So he seems to have calculated that the only way he'll advance his career is by sinking his teeth into Nagasaka. Well, what do you say to all that?
I'm in shock, said Kazuki, staring intently at Kawaji.
Shocked at the findings of your investigation, but more shocked by the fact of the investigation itself. Your colleagues had better watch out! What was perhaps most surprising of all, however, was the calmness in which Kawaji had just relayed all this. Esmeralda, thankfully, had been enthralled by the scene outside throughout this conversation, but at this point she finally turned around and said something. "Is the show already over?" asked Kawaji, to which Kazuki nodded and smiled vaguely. "Yes, but apparently something's about to happen." Far-sighted though Chief Inspector Kawaji was, what happened next well exceeded any premonition he might have had. Chapter 7. On the night of the 28th of the 11th lunar month, an incident occurred in which an Englishman by the name of Long was attacked. The man was an overseas teacher at a government school. It later came to light that he had been a barber in his native country, and he had taken a Japanese woman as his mistress. On the evening in question, while accompanying her on a walk in Kanda Sodacho, where the night stalls were open, he was suddenly set upon by an imposing figure brandishing a sword and sustained a serious wound to his shoulder. When a crowd gathered, attracted by the mistress's screams, the assailant fled. Though Long narrowly escaped with his life, the British envoy Sir Harry Parkes lodged a formal protest with the Japanese government. The assailant was said to have sported a beard and looked like a samurai, and what's more, he apparently wielded an exceptionally large sword. Although his name and whereabouts were unknown, within a matter of days, Kawaji learned that there was a suspicion in the Imperial Prosecuting Office that the man was none other than the fugitive from justice, Toneo Nakai. On the 3rd of the following month, Kawaji heard about another curious incident from Kazuki. A report had come in from Jirōmasa Saruki, the Razotsu attached to the Tsukiji foreign settlement, that on the morning of the 2nd, a bundle of straw used for sword testing had been found lying at the bottom of the stairs in the great hall of the hotel, cut in two. What could it mean? I've no idea. Apparently the porter found it.
Truly, it was a mystery.
Incidentally, said Kawaji after a pause, did you know that there's a rumor going around that the assailant in the long case might have been Toneo Nakai? I'd heard that, yes. But what are they basing it on? The fact alone that the assailant used a long sword? I don't really know. From what I gather, Nagasaka and Sugi seem to think so and are operating on that basis. Perhaps they know something we don't. It wouldn't surprise me to learn that Nakai's ideas had led him to attack a foreigner. Couldn't you say the same for Gensai Kawakami? And Ushinosuke Shimozu, though? Apparently the man was well built and had a beard. That sounds rather like Ushinosuke. That one's capable of anything, but they have alibis. On the 28th, they were both at the Tsukiji hotel from morning till night. Kazuki had taught Kawaji the word alibi, and hearing it now made him laugh. You've done your research. Indeed, I have, said Kawaji, looking slightly embarrassed. Nagasaka may not be the most reliable officer when it comes to a manhunt, said Kazuki. But if Nakai really is the culprit, then Nagasaka will have some answering to do. It's only natural that he's eager to catch him by any means necessary. Only, it seems that Sugi is even more determined to score a victory with this. Incidentally, their alibis for the night in question aside, Kawakami and Shimozu are both claiming they had nothing to do with the bundle of straw. I expect you already knew this. Still, there's something that doesn't quite add up about their stay at the Tsukiji hotel. The incident that well exceeded any premonition that Kawaji might have had, however, was not the attack on the foreigner. Instead, it was the tragedy that was discovered in the aforementioned hole beneath the bell tower of the Tsukiji Hotel on the morning of the 7th, some 4 days later. That morning, at around 8:30, in the small house that he rented in Kyobashi, Kawaji received an urgent message from Sergeant Imokawa. Sir, please come to the Tsukiji Hotel immediately. Chief Inspector Kazuki has requested your presence. The Tsukiji Hotel? Kazuki? What's happened? There's been a murder, sir. A murder? Who's the victim? I received the order from Sergeant Saruki, so I'm afraid I don't know, sir. But he said to come as quickly as possible. Kawaji and Imokawa raced to Tsukiji as fast as their legs would carry them. It was so cold that they could see their breath. Following Sergeant Imokawa, Kawaji entered, as he had done before, by the side gate, then passing through the garden to arrive at the bottom of the tower. A door opened onto the vast hall, where he found a group of people standing like frozen silhouettes at the foot of the great column. The late winter's morning had already long dawned, but the hall was still in darkness. A dozen or so men stood there in a semicircle, mostly with their backs to him, and the first faces he managed to make out were those of Gensai Kawakami and Ushinosuke Shimozu. The others were mostly Razotsu, but one figure then turned to look over his shoulder. It was Kazuki. Thank you for coming, he said. Kawaji drew nearer until he stood next to Kazuki.
Among the figures, he noticed Nagasaka and his daughter, Okumi. He thought, wasn't that her name? And the porter too. Then, right in the middle of them, he saw a body stretched out on the floor. There, lying in a pool of blood, his abdomen clearly cut open and his innards spilling out, was Tetsuma Sugi. Chapter 8.
I came as fast as I could when Saruki told me the news, and this is the scene I was faced with,
said Kazuki.
I've heard various views from the people involved, but my head's in a spin. I'd like to hear your opinion, Kawaji, if you wouldn't mind. Deputy Commissioner? From the top.
Deputy Commissioner Nagasaka was quivering like a jellyfish. Though, in effect, he was being questioned by his subordinates. He did not object, and with trembling lips, he began his tale.
Well, you know about the case of the attack on Mr. Long? It was Deputy Inspector Sugi who suggested that the assailant might have been Tonio Nakai, the fugitive involved in the assassination of Yokoi-sensei. There are certain circumstances regarding this individual's escape for which I bear responsibility. That being so, Sugi and I wanted to apprehend him ourselves at any cost and were desperate to learn his whereabouts. Anyway, the day before yesterday, Sugi reported that Nakai's mistress was apparently somewhere in the Shin Shimabara pleasure quarter of the foreign settlement and that the wounded Nakai was hiding there.
This startling fact, which he was hearing for the very first time, made Kawaji's eyes widen in astonishment.
Sugi didn't tell me to which establishment the girl belonged. He had great faith in his own abilities, so he only made me aware of the fact itself. Then, yesterday morning, we learned that two of Nakai's associates were also hiding out in the establishment, posing as customers. So, if we were to arrest them, we would have to prepare for a considerable number of casualties. He expressed his reservations about causing a bloodbath in the foreign settlement of all places. Then, yesterday evening, Sugi somehow managed to arrange things with a woman, and the next morning again, that is to say, this morning, Nakai left the pleasure quarter alone and went on his way. Sugi had said that he intended to apprehend him at the guardhouse, and that Nakai would of course be unaware of our movements. However, although it was easy enough to get Nakai to leave the establishment, nobody knew which direction he would go or which bridge he would attempt to cross. As everybody knows, there are more than a dozen bridges leading out of the settlement. There are even ones without guardhouses. Naturally, Sugi said he would take the precaution of having Razotsu stationed at every one of them. But, so that Nakai wouldn't notice him following, he wanted to go on ahead and wait for him at whichever bridge he was headed for. So, Sugi suggested that I go to the Tsukiji hotel this morning under cover of darkness and keep watch from the top of the tower. As Kazuki and Kawaji saw only the other day, there are large windows on all four sides there, giving a panoramic view of the foreign settlement. By the same stroke, the tower, with me going around and around inside it, can be seen from anywhere in the settlement, including the guardhouses. From my vantage point, I could communicate Nakai's whereabouts and the direction he was headed using gestures. The idea was that Sugi would follow my instructions while the Rosotsu would be on alert at their posts. What's more, Sugi didn't just ask me to keep watch, but he wanted my daughter, Okumi, to accompany me as well. When I asked why, he replied to the effect that I couldn't be trusted. I am known to be a little careless at times, so I could see his logic. He added that it would made me look good. He added that it would made me look good. Make me look good? You'll be commander-in-chief of the operation to capture Nakai, he told me. To tell the truth, I agreed with him, and I was grateful to him for this bizarre-seeming method of surveillance and direction. So, this morning I did just as he said. I came here while it was still dark and had the porter show me to the top of the tower. The porter nodded. Given Nagasaka's rank, he would not have been able to refuse him. Okumi and I went around and around keeping watch. Night turned to day, but no matter how we looked, there was no sign of Sugi or the man with the long sword in its red lacquered sheath. And at that early hour, it wouldn't have been hard to spot anybody in the streets of the foreign settlement. But even with our eyes peeled, we couldn't see a thing. Isn't that right, Okumi? His daughter nodded, her complexion like pear blossom. Meanwhile, 6:30 went by, then 7 o'clock. I know this because I heard the clock tower of the American trading post opposite the Akashi Bridge strike the hour with its loud bell. I believe it tolls at 7 o'clock in the morning, at noon, and then again at 7 o'clock in the evening. Just as the chimes were fading away, I heard a strange sound come from the bottom of the stairs. I don't quite know how to describe it. We both looked at one another, and so bracing myself, I left my daughter to keep watch, while I made my way down the spiral staircase. And that's when I found Deputy Inspector Sugi lying like this, with Gensai Kawakami and Ishinosuke Shimozu standing by his side. Kawaji crouched down and looked at Sugi's corpse. His abdomen had practically been cut in half. It seemed to have been slashed in a single clean blow from one side to the other. It must have taken some skill. Horrifying was the only word for it. Death would have come instantly, but still the corpse's eyes seemed to glitter with rage. Kawaji then noticed the fresh blood splattered around, not just on the floor, but up the first half a dozen or so steps of the spiral staircase. He also spotted, next to Kawakami and Shimozu, a sword some 3 feet long, drenched in blood, and beside it a pair of magnolia wood geta. Kawaji shot a look at Ishinosuke's feet. He was not wearing his usual geta, but instead had on a pair of sandals like those provided by the hotel. It looks like somebody has been testing their blade, said Kawakami as he looked at the body and forced a smile. If he did use Shikanosuke to test his sword, as they say he did, that's exactly how he would have done it. But I regret to say that it was neither Ishinosuke nor I who did this. The reason being that we do not yet have conclusive evidence regarding Shikanosuke's case. A short while ago, we heard a knocking at our door. When the door opened, we saw the porter and this Razotsu standing there. He nodded towards Sergeant Saruki. He said there was something to do with Shikanosuke's case that needed to be discussed, and that Deputy Inspector Sugi was waiting in the garden behind the hotel. So would we come with him immediately? By all means, we thought. We checked with the porter, who told us that it was the garden between the bell tower and the water. Without having to ask, we knew that you could get there through this hall. After the Razotsu and the porter left, we dressed and headed out. It must have been... yes, just before we entered the hall, the big clock in the hallway chimed. Thinking about it, it must have been 7 o'clock. That was when I heard this strange noise, so I rushed to open the hall door, and when I entered, I found the poor bastard lying here like this. I looked around, but saw nobody. When I opened the door on the other side, the long corridor was deserted. Ushinosuke went to the door leading into the rear garden, but again, there was no one there, except that Razotsu, who was standing on the opposite side. Kawaji looked in the direction where Kawakami was nodding and saw Sergeant Yokomakura. The deputy inspector told me to wait there, explained Yokomakura. Did you arrive with Deputy Inspector Sugi? Asked Kawaji. I did, sir. Then the deputy inspector entered the premises via the back door by himself. At any rate, said Kawakami, we returned to Sugi's body, and we were wondering what on earth had happened. When who should come down the stairs but Nagasaka? Sergeant Yokomakura, said Kawaji. At what time did Deputy Inspector Sugi arrive here? The American clock opposite the Akashi Bridge began tolling just after the deputy inspector went inside. Then, not long afterwards, the samurai with the beard opened the door and peered out. He had a terrible look on his face. Next, I saw Saruki come round the outside from the main entrance, and after a brief discussion with him, he went to investigate. Shocked and horrified by what he saw, he told me to go and send for Chief Inspector Kazuki. After Kazuki had arrived, he must have had Sergeant Imokawa run and fetch Kawaji. But just what was Sugi doing here? Kawaji asked the Razotsu. I believe he said something about having urgent business with one of the guests, sir, said Saruki, after which he and Yokomakura said in chorus, That's all we know, sir. Kawaji's eyes now looked elsewhere. What are those doing there? He walked over to the pair of geta lying in the pool of blood and picked them up. They were large and made of magnolia wood and had thick straps. They look just like the ones I've been wearing, grumbled Ushinosuke. Mine are in my room. I don't know whose these are. Although the building mixed both Japanese and Western styles, nobody was likely to go around in geta indoors. Then again, nobody but this man seemed to wear geta like this. On the face of it, it looks like we did it, said Kawakami after a pause. The trace of a bitter smile still played on his lips. But I didn't kill him. As I said the other day, I've taken a vow never to kill again. This excuse was unlikely to pass muster, at least not with this individual. Pass muster. Be accepted as adequate or satisfactory. Pass muster.
This excuse was unlikely to pass muster, at least not with this individual.
Now you'll be wondering whether it was Ishinosuke who did it. But no. Show them your sword, Ushi.
At his request, Ishinosuke slowly unsheathed the sword at his waist and showed it to them. Shing! They all stared in amazement. Though the red lacquered scabbard was 3 feet long, the sword that emerged from it was useless, the blade having been broken in half.
Because of my actions, there's many a man who would want to try to kill me, but I vowed never to kill again. That's why I take strapping Ishinosuke with me everywhere as my bodyguard, even making him wear geta, so that he'll seem all the more imposing, but it's all for show. Nobody has suggested that you use that sword to kill him. It's the one lying there that did it, said Kazuki, pointing to the long sword covered in blood on the floor. It was clear that this was the murder weapon. It would appear that we've been caught in a trap, Kawakami said in an imperious tone. The faintest smile on his lips was fast disappearing. And just what was Nagasaka-san doing up in that tower anyway? Doesn't that strike you as most suspicious?
I've already told you my reasons for being there, Nagasaka cut in.
In any case, you claim that you've fallen into a trap and that somebody else is to blame. But where else would we find somebody who could cut Sugi, a man who was famed throughout Higo as a master swordsman, so magnificently in half? I could never do it. I'm no swordsman. And besides, just the other day a bundle of straw was found in this very room, cut in two, they say. I've no idea what it means, but I'm certain that was your handiwork as well.
This is outrageous. We had nothing to do with that.
Well, leaving that aside, you must have seen me come down from the very top of the tower when you discovered the body, said Nagasaka. According to everybody's testimony, Sugi must have been killed at around 7 o'clock. For now, let's say that it was at 7. I was in the tower at that time. My daughter can confirm this. And if her testimony isn't good enough, there are others who witnessed it.
Most of the Razotsu nodded. They must have been the ones keeping an eye on the tower from their posts.
At any rate, I couldn't just run up and down this steep spiral staircase in an instant. Why, it's absurd even to suggest that it was me. For one thing, I had no reason to kill Sugi.
Objectively speaking, said Kawaji, turning to Kawakami, it would appear that I must ask you to accompany me to the Imperial Prosecuting Office. No, I won't go, he said, shaking his head, his voice growing more and more irate. I won't. You government dogs, you're all in on it. Going to these lengths to trap me, are you? Is that how much I scare you? Well, if you mean to take me down, I'm ready for you.
Kawakami sounded as though he were about to kill someone, whether or not he himself realized it. But Kawaji shook his head with composure. No, there are some things that still need to be cleared up.
Such as? Asked Kazuki.
For one thing, why Deputy Inspector Sugi came here in the first place, said Kawaji. And what about Toneo Nakai? Where has he gone?
But as far as the murder of Sugi is concerned,
there's nobody except those two who could have done it, said Nagasaka in a shrill voice as he backed away and hid behind Kawaji. Chief Inspector, take him to the Imperial Prosecuting Office at once! That's an order! Do you understand it, Kawaji? Asked Kazuki. I don't. At least, I don't understand Sugi's behavior. Do you? No, I can't work it out either. That's why I called you here.
Kazuki tilted his head slightly and stared off into the distance. For starters, I think we should send for Esmeralda. Esmeralda? You mean that French? Began Kawaji, wearing a look of bewilderment. Whatever for? It's a long story, and we don't have the time to go into it right now, but suffice it to say I've had her trained as a miko. Curiously enough, the old priestess who taught her has made surprising progress. Lately, she's even been able to summon the dead. Everybody was dumbfounded. If we send for her, we can have her summon the spirit of Deputy Inspector Sugi. But that's absurd! I'm sorry, but a corpse can't tell us why Sugi came to this hotel. I want to hear it from the mouth of the man himself. Just let me do this one thing. Oh, and while we're at it, there are a few others I'd like you to send for as well. Without divulging the details, Kazuki called over Saruki, Yoko Makoru, and Imokawa, and gave them their orders. The three Razotsu then bowed and went racing out the door and into the garden. Chapter 9. Before even an hour had gone by, a convoy of palanquins arrived in quick succession, bringing the people Kazuki had sent for. To the surprise of Kawakami and the others, it included none other than Nobuyoshi Kaeda and 5 other grandees from the Imperial Prosecuting Office, who must have come straight from the department itself. Even Naotsugu Manabe and his daughter Onui were there, both looking perplexed and wondering why they had been summoned. Yet, what drew the eye more than this pageant of dignitaries was of course the beautiful foreign lady in their midst. Kaeda and his colleagues were dressed in their usual eboshi and ceremonial robes, but Esmeralda entered the hall wearing an ichimegasa with a long veil. These were removed to reveal underneath a blue-eyed woman with long golden hair trailing down her back, dressed in a pair of scarlet hakama and a white silk haori with long sleeves. It was still wonder that Kawakami's jaw dropped, and for a moment he was quite speechless. In the time it took them to arrive, Kazuki had ordered a porter and a Razotsu to place a table in front of the large column in the hall and to lay out Sugi's mutilated corpse on top of it. He also had 6 chairs brought in separately. Having seated the officials in these chairs, Kawaji proceeded to give them an outline of the case and to explain who was involved in it. Meanwhile, Kazuki and Esmeralda arranged the mirrors, a bow and prayer beads that she had brought with her around the body, and covered it with bamboo leaves, leaving only the face visible. All the while they whispered together in a foreign language. Esmeralda had had a large cart brought, which had carried, in addition to the above items, ancient musical instruments, including a large kaendaiko decorated with a pattern of flames, as well as several smaller kakko hourglass drums. Pushing and pulling the cart were Sergeants Onimaru and Ichinohata, who had until now been nowhere to be seen. "Ye deities in heaven," began Kazuki. "I, Keishiro Kazuki,
Do respectfully summon the spirit of the deceased Deputy Inspector Sugi.
As he spoke, the instruments were laid out on the floor, and the 5 Razotsu, the usual suspects, sat down cross-legged beside them.
Though still inexperienced, said Kazuki, now speaking plainly, these men have, at my bidding, undertaken to learn the art of Kagura.
Each of the Razotsu wore a dignified, solemn look. Nobody dared laugh. The dead man's body was lying face up on the table. The scene was set, and the hall, with its enormous pillar in the middle, seemed to be transformed into a temple. Onimaru struck the kain daiko, whereupon the flutes and drums began to play, and the strains of solemn music flowed. Still standing, the golden-haired Miko closed her eyes and began to chant slowly.
Awariya asobihasu tomo mo sanu asakurani amatsukami kunitsukami orimashimase.
At first, the observers thought the words were foreign, possibly because some parts of the intonation did not sound very Japanese. The musical accompaniment was also in disarray, but that only added to the otherworldly effect.
Awariya asobihasu tomo mo sanu asakurani naru izuchimo orimashimase.
As she chanted, Esmeralda moved and twisted her body in an uncanny manner. Kawaji stood there dumbfounded. As all this was going on, he saw Kazuki say something to the porter, after which the porter went over and said something to Kawakami, who, as if he were not bamboozled enough already, nodded, looking more and more perplexed, after which the porter left the hall.
Awariya asobihasu tomo mo zanu asakurani tsugi tetsuma no mitama mairi tamae.
The Kagura bells that the Miko was holding suddenly rang out.
Cling, clang, 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 clang. Ima Mairu.
The atmosphere in the still gloomy hall seemed to grow even darker.
I am the spirit of Sugi Tetsuma.
Everybody in the room was startled. The Miko's voice had changed, and for the first time they could understand the words. Though the timbre was different, the voice was still unmistakably Esmeralda's, with its strange accent. Yet it looked as though the body on the table, its eyes still staring heavenward, had just moved its mouth.
For the first time since arriving in the land of the dead, I can see the land of the living without hindrance. Before my death, I did not know why I died, but now, at last, I know. The man who killed me was Deputy Commissioner Nagasaka.
What is the meaning of this? Exclaimed Nagasaka in a strange voice. What is Sugi, or rather that woman, saying? The Kagura bells rang out once more, cutting him off.
Clang, clang, cling, cling.
At this point, Kawaji saw the porter come in carrying a length of rope and a bundle of straw under his arm. Then he saw him place it, with the help of one of the Rozotsu, on the 5th or 6th step of the staircase. Then take the rope and set about tying it to the railing on both sides. Standing over him, Kazuki whispered his instructions. and then picked up the bloody sword and geta. Nobody apart from Kawaji, however, appeared to notice this.
Nagasaka said that Toneo Nakai was hiding in the foreign settlement, but all that was a lie. Knowing that it was a lie, he ordered the Razotsu to their posts and climbed the tower.
This is an outrage!
I had no idea that Nagasaka would do such a thing. Early this morning, I was summoned by Sergeant Saruki and Yokomakura. They told me that Nagasaka and his daughter Okumi had been kidnapped by Kawakami and were locked up in the tower. I immediately rushed over.
And this is preposterous! Dead men don't say things like this! Protested Nagasaka. A shiver ran down Kawaji's spine. The substance of what the Miko had to say was startling enough, but despite what Nagasaka said, the voice was undoubtedly that of the late Sugi. There was no other explanation for it, for how else could the foreign lady who had only just arrived know how he spoke? Then again, was it possible that the deceased could know things in death that he hadn't known in life? Even Kawaji had not noticed, however, that during all this, Kazuki, who had been standing at the top of the stairs, had suddenly vanished. Who knew when or where? I entered the foreign settlement and was told by the Razotsu to look at the top of the tower. There I saw Nagasaka and his daughter Okumi. I believed that they had been kidnapped by Kawakami. I ran into the hotel in a daze and raced up the stairs. Just then, the people in the hall heard a strange sound like something sliding. Meanwhile, Saruki lured Kawakami and Ishinosuke to this hall. Something came flying down the stairs at a terrific speed. The glinting object appeared and disappeared 3 or 4 times as it made its way around the great pillar. After I had taken 5 or 6 steps from the bottom, there was a sudden snapping sound. Everybody looked as the bundle of straw that had been standing there was sliced in two, and the unbound top half tumbled down the stairs. The cut had been made horizontally by a single long blade. The sword had something strange attached to it on either side, but as soon as it cut the bundle of straw, it went flying while the attachments dislodged themselves. 2 magnolia wood geta. I was slain. They all stared at this terrifying mechanism as if petrified, realizing that the teeth of the geta had hugged the handrail, allowing it to slide all the way down the staircase. The sword had been slipped through the straps so as not to slide. At the same time, the weight of the sword held the 2 geta in place, preventing them from coming off and speeding up their descent. All this time, the strange, otherworldly music was still playing. The 5 Razotsu were all puffing out their cheeks and beating their drums with great intensity and zeal. As I ran up the stairs, leaning forward, the speeding sword cut right into my stomach. At this point, the straps of the geta were touching the back of the blade, so they could not cut them.
Ordinarily, as soon as the sword touched me, I would have been knocked back, but because the staircase is spiral, it cut me at an angle, in a single blow, just as it would have done in a sword fight. Just before that, I heard a strange sound above my head, but the hall was still in darkness, and because of the spiral staircase, I couldn't see the weapon sliding down. This is how Nagasaka was able to kill me, from all the way up in the tower.
There was a noise amid the crowd of people. Nagasaka's daughter had collapsed.
The only reason, Nagasaka said, that Toneo Nakai was about to leave the foreign settlement was so that he could have the Resotsu testify that he was at the top of the tower when the murder took place.
Kazuki came down the stairs having provided this demonstration of the murder.
Nagasaka came up with this trick after seeing the guillotine. 5 days ago, he cut a bundle of straw here to see whether the sword would slide well, and whether it would really cut it. The reason he left it where it lay was so that he could throw suspicion on Kawakami and Ushinosuke later. Of course, this is also why they were lured to this hall today.
Before he knew it, Nagasaka was cowering beside the unconscious Okumi, his balding pate pressed to her body.
The scrupulous Nagasaka planned this elaborate murder. It was an act of villainy. His resolve came from his desperation to protect his own happiness. Not only did he want to murder me because of my love for Okumi, but at the same time, he wanted to do away with Kawakami and Ishinosuke, who were trying to expose his old failures.
The Kakura bells rang out once more.
Clang, clang! Is it right for a man who reports to the Imperial Prosecuting Office to murder for the sake of himself and his family? Surely, he must be put to the guillotine.
With a dull thud, Onimaru struck the Kaien Daiko. Donk! Esmeralda, who had given voice to this fearsome lament of the dead, seemed to fall into a trance and spoke no more.
It looks like it's over, said Kazuki,
suddenly appearing at Kawaji's side. However, Kawaji, together with the other representatives of the Imperial Prosecuting Office and even Kawakami and Oshinosuke, just sat there, motionless, like shadows in the realm of the dead.
All this would make Miss Okumi here an accomplice, said Kazuki, turning to the assembled dignitaries. But in light of the circumstances, I would ask that she be pardoned.
Still, none of them uttered a word.
Take Deputy Commissioner Nagasaka to the Imperial Prosecuting Office,
Kazuki then ordered. The 5 Razotsu approached Nagasaka, who was still cowering. But, Kazuki, said Kawaji, returning to his senses,
doesn't this mean that some of the Razotsu could be complicit too? That may well be so. I'd even say it's highly likely,
said Kazuki, almost in a whisper.
But it's also likely that they had their arms twisted by Nagasaka, though I suspect they'll be glad to see the back of Deputy Inspector Sugi. They did ultimately help to solve the case. We'll reprimand them later. For the time being at least, I think we should overlook this.
However, before Kawaji could say anything else, Kazuki went over to Manabe and his daughter.
As you've just heard, sir, it would appear that I've won this round with Kawaji. As for the translation, it's finished, and tomorrow will be 1 month to the day just as promised, but I do think it would be a good idea to let the girl stay in Japan a little while longer.
Manabe, however, seemed not to hear Kazuki's words, for Esmeralda, once again wearing her long veil, was walking towards Onui. Her eyes widened in astonishment as the French woman bowed to her with all the elegance of a lady of the Heian court.
Bonjour, said Esmeralda, smiling through her veil. How do you do, mademoiselle Onui?